Welcome to this episode of the Patrick Coffin Show. Before I say one more word, I want to make sure that you know that there exists software that not only blocks pornography from every device in your house, it also provides accountability. So it treats adults like adults. So if you are a family that are concerned about the instant availability of the most disgusting, horrifying, illegal, obscene content available on the internet, then go to covenanteyes.com. Covenanteyes.com is on every device here in Coffin Land. Every laptop, every tablet, every computer, every PC that we have going runs Covenant Eyes. What I love about it is it's for people who don't want to reduce their porn income or intake. They want it to go to zero. So if you go to covenanteyes.com, put my name, Patrick, as a coupon at the checkout, you can get 30 days to test drive this bad boy. I promise you, no one has come back to say, that was kind of not worth it. It's a monthly membership to Covenant Eyes, and I guarantee it's going to win you over. It's simple to use, even if you're not tech savvy, as I, believe it or not, am not. So go to covenanteyes.com. My name, Patrick, as a coupon at the checkout, gives you 30 days to test drive this magnificent software. So with that said, we're going to turn to our topic and our guest. If you're a teacher, if you're a principal, if you're a youth minister, if you're a mom or a dad or a grandparent, and you like to read to your kids, this is going to be an extremely important episode for you to hear. In fact, I'm going to give a little bit of an adult advisory content at the top. We're not going to use the potty words that are described in this book, but we are going to talk in a frank, direct way about how the content of books for middle schools, upper schools, young adults has shifted, especially since the 80s. It's really gained steam in a very scary direction. And my guest is Debbie DeGroff. I was introduced to her by my good friend and guest, Dr. Judith Reisman. You can see that episode in the show notes at patrickcoffin.media. I talked with her about her research blowing the lid off the criminal activities of Alfred Kinsey. I'm sure that'll come up in the conversation I have today with Debbie. She was reading along with her kids when they became reading age back in the 80s, as I mentioned, and she discovered that these are not the books that our generation grew up with. And you will not believe the foul, dangerous, destructive, profane, obscene content that is thrown at young people, not just in the U.S. This is not just an American problem. The book that she compiled after unbelievable amount of research is called Between the Covers: What's Inside a Children's Book. The website to check out is what'sinkidsbooks.org. The author, Debbie DeGroff, joins me today. Hello, Debbie.
Hi, Patrick. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for doing all the heavy lifting. I couldn't help but, after a while, you get a nerd to all the F-bombs and the C-bombs and the MF bombs. But you have, how many books did you read to get this thing together, approximately?
Thousands, because I did this for about 35 years. And I read profusely all the time I was growing up. So I say that there's really only about 7 years I wasn't reading children's books. Mm-hmm. So, yes.
And, well, one thing that impresses me the most about the book and about you is that you're not a professional academe figure. Right. You do not have a PhD in literature, but you have homeschooled. You are, as you say, an avid reader, a lover of reading. You've got, I understand, a growing passel of kids and now grandkids. So congratulations. Yes. To me, that qualifies you more. So you're outside of the ivory tower with its dappled shadows. I grew up with books like, you might remember Jean Latham's Newbery Award winner, Carry On, Mr. Bowditch.
I love that book. Yeah, I still do.
Yeah, yes. I don't know why it has not been made into a movie. Wonderful story, even if you're bad at math like I am. Mm-hmm. Go Dog Go, all the P.D. Eastman books, Dr. Seuss. Maybe Dr. Seuss is a good one to start with, Debbie, in the famous limiting 200 and some words and what that did to young children. And Dr. Seuss's, Theodore Geisel's later regret that he went along to get along. Tell us about Dr. Seuss and that whole story.
Well, when they threw out phonics, they really started in the 1930s, Patrick. Mm-hmm. I mean, where it basically became across the nation and across the board. And so in the 30s, we were going through a depression, and people weren't really paying attention to what their children were getting in a curricula. They were paying attention to putting food on the table.
Yeah.
in the 40s, the moms were out of the home for the first time. And, and the dads, the uncles, the brothers were all off in war. And so nobody was still paying attention. But when things settled down in the 50s, parents started realizing their children couldn't read. And Rudolph Flesch in 1955 wrote his famous book, Why Johnny Can't Read, and what you can do about it. Mm-hmm. So Dr. Seuss was hired, and he was given a list of this new controlled vocabulary of learning to recognize words. And the numbers vary that he was given, from the basal reader. But he ended up using 223 words from the list to write The Cat in the Hat, plus 13 words that weren't on the list. And in 1981, in an article, interview, actually, he did with Arizona Magazine, he rued the day. He said that when Dewey and the Progressives threw out phonics and exchanged teaching reading into something like Chinese pictographs, that was the greatest thing to destroy literacy. So some of the things I bring out in my book is, why would they do that? Why would you take something that worked and replace it with something that they already knew would not?
Maybe one more onion layer beneath Dr. Seuss and backwards in time would be John Dewey and the Columbia education revolution. I continue to be astounded at how few parents know who John Dewey was and his influence in things like Common Core and objective-based outcomes and subtle social engineering. Who was John Dewey and what's his legacy?
Well, he was one of the progressives. Okay, he eventually went to Columbia, but there was a whole group of progressives at that time. And Dewey knew, basically, they wanted a socialist form of government. I mean, they didn't want the type of government we had. And our society was very literate, no matter what rank in society you were. We had a very, very literate society. You think that even when we were in colonial days, before we were actually our own individual country, when, prior to the revolution starting, the average people were reading Thomas Paine.
Right.
And then you think later the Federalist Papers, the Anti-Federalist Papers, this was your common people reading these things. And so, as he started, he turned things to more a social atmosphere for children learning rather than an academic. And he wanted to slow down the literacy. He tried to teach that it was wrong to be devoting those first years to teaching the kids to read. Sam Blumenfeld and Alex Newman wrote a book, the last book while Sam Blumenfeld was alive, called Crimes of the Educators. And that gives a lot of background into Dewey and what was going on with the progressives.
But I'm going to try to keep up with you, Carolyn, because I like to give links to Amazon, to the resources that we mentioned. Blumenthal, okay, Crimes of the Educators.
Blumenfeld,
yep,
yes.
Blumenfeld,
and Alex Newman, yes.
Okay, very good. I remember what jump-started my love of reading was the Franklin W. Dixon Hardy Boy series. That's a nom de plume, a pseudonym of Charles McFarland, I think his name was. McFarland's son became a famous National Hockey League commentator. That's Franklin W. Dixon's his real son. And then, of course, Carolyn Keene, which I understand is also a nom de plume for the Nancy Drew stories. Yeah.
There were over 100 series that were written just by Edward Stratomer. Okay, and he actually, before he started his syndicate, he actually wrote the Rover Boys in the late 1800s, which sold 5 million copies. Now, when the Hardy Boys, yes, we all grew up. I grew up with the Nancy Drew and, of course, read some Hardy Boys, too. But when those came out, the librarians wouldn't even put them on the shelf. Okay, and they were commended for not putting them on the shelf.
Why?
This was so far removed from the literature that the kids were reading. So, you think that they were reading Thackeray, they were reading Dickens, they were reading these things for pleasure. They didn't have TV at the turn of the century.
I see what you're saying. So the librarians that refused to put this on would be praised in the same way that a school would be praised for not providing sugar for students, but rather vegetables.
Yes. Yes, and they just believed it was going to destroy their creativity, their imagination. If they read one book, they were going to read them all, and they're basically the same. Now, I devoured them when I was a child.
Yeah, me too.
But as an adult, when you go back and read them, you see that they're all the same. But you don't see that when you're a young child. Now, I'm not saying it's wrong to read, Nancy Drew or the Hardy Boys. I'm just telling you it was a big drop from what the kids were used to reading academically. They were reading things when they were very young that our college kids don't read today.
No, that's literally true.
Yes.
You think of, well, I'm from Nova Scotia, so I spent a lot of childhood summers in Cavendish, which is the fictional Avonlea for the Anne of Green Gables series. And those are, I read them to my daughters, and they love them because it's not Thackeray, it's not Dickens, but no less than Mark Twain wrote a letter of appreciation for the character of Anne Shirley. Very different from young adult stuff that's now force fed to our young people, and we're definitely going to get them. You've got in between the covers on page 11, Louisa May Alcott, Rudyard Kipling, Robert Louis Stevenson, Mark Twain, Laura Ingalls Wilder. You could add Lucy Maud Montgomery. Those books are now considered a little bit above the average pre-teenager.
The age range that would have read them when we were children, yes, they have what they call reading levels now, and the kids are not capable of reading it until actually the interest. They've outgrown the interest, yes.
Or maybe their tastes have been shifted and manipulated so that interest is taken off the table.
Absolutely. Because, you started out talking about covenant eyes. And if you start feeding your children donuts 3 times a day, they'll like sugar. And it's the same thing with these books. You introduce them to textual porn when they are 8, 9 years old, then they gravitate to harder textual porn. And then the real thing, of course.
You've got a passage from the July 1899 edition of St. Nicholas.
Yes.
And it goes to what you're saying. Normally I'm quite allergic to reading because it's radio, but I'll make an exception. A special reason for giving to young readers books established among English classics is that it educates them in modes of feeling and expression other than those in fashion in their own little hour. Yes. When we're young, we're plastic and are easily moved to sympathize with many styles. And the man who in youth has never learned the accents of the masters of an earlier day is sadly apt to remain imprisoned in his own time to his lasting impoverishment. That's a beautiful passage.
It is. These are, I don't know if you can see it, these are St. Nicholas books.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Okay. Yep. They came as a regular magazine. I just happen to have them on the shelf beside me here. It was a regular magazine that came out every month, and Mary Mapes Dodge that wrote Hans Brinker's and the Silver Skates, she was the editor for many, 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 many years until her death, yes.
I have not heard that title in a long time. You just brought back a whole bunch of memories.
Yeah.
Interesting. How about the Boxcar Children by Gertrude Warner?
Okay. Gertrude Chandler Warner actually wrote the Boxcar Children, the first one, in 1924. She was a school teacher. And what people don't realize is when they get the first book for their children, it's not the original one that she wrote. They had her rewrite it in 1942, and it was with the controlled vocabulary. And if people don't really understand what a controlled vocabulary is, that means that there were certain lists of words in the basal readers. That would have been nationwide, most of them, correlated with each other. And so when you had a certain list of words that you were learning to recognize, so you could no longer read them, you're learning them by repetition, then the books that were developed for the children to read at that age range had to use that same controlled vocabulary. So people can go, I think they can just go to Gutenberg Press, and they can compare the 1924 edition, and they'll find words like harmonious, rapturous, delicatessen, delegating, And of course, all of those words are removed in the edition that the parents are familiar with today.
Doesn't that happen with other classics like Ivanhoe and the works of Dickens? You get this abridged, completely watered-down version that they often don't even credit Charles Dickens with writing it.
Yes, that's exactly right. Now, it really is a different thing. But now we have the revisions, the adaptations, the graphic novels. And when I say graphic novels, I think a lot of parents, when you hear that term, you think that means it's adult. And, and that okay, but it's not. It's basically a comic book form. So in Gertrude Chandler's Warner, I happen to have the second book of the series, Surprise Island. I have one of the very old copies. And it tells you right in the back of the book that it is using a controlled vocabulary. But you're right. I heard a little girl in a bookstore one time ask me for advice of what to read. And I was showing her Swiss Family Robinson. And she said she'd already read that. She didn't like it. And she started telling me all of this environmental hogwash. And I'm sitting here thinking, where did that come from?
Yeah.
And she pointed to one of the, revisions or adaptations, whatever it was. And it did not hold true to the story whatsoever.
Prior to this controlled vocabulary list, when young students, pupils, children would learn English as a language to speak and to write, they would learn it phonetically. And one advantage of that, and this is part of the premise of your book, is that you learn how English sound like. When you see the word, you learn to spell out, to speak out, sound out what these diphthongs and word combinations. How many different sounds are there in English? I forget the
44
number.
sounds.
44 sounds. So if you came upon a word in a book like, let's say, Bleak House or anything by Mark Twain, you would not come to a brick wall or a dead end. You might hiccup a bit and go through it. Oh, it must be that.
Yes.
And the key is, because I had to read A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess in high school. The movie's terrible. The book is a lot more interesting than the book, but still very gnarly for a teen boy to be reading. And that's, if you're familiar with that book, it's written in Nadsat. It's a teenage argot. First page, you're lost because it's very strange, based on Russian words. But you get to understand what the words mean by usage and by context. If you don't know English phonetically, then you're quickly going to be lost because there's no way for you to surmount the question mark. How's this pronounced and what does this mean? Does that drive and sort of solidify the ignorance?
Well, it does. I have a friend, a very good friend, that's a school teacher, and she teaches 6th grade. And one of the comments she hears all the time is, I don't remember that word. Now, why would you have to remember a word if you know how to read?
Yep.
And probably when you're in school, you were taught a lot of dictionary skills, and you were taught syllabication. So instead of looking at fantastic as just a group of letters, you knew how to break it down. You were sounding it out, fantastic, and it was very, very easy to spell. But it's a foreign word to the kids today because they're looking at it as a whole picture. It's not any different than me giving you a list of numbers, and I say 7, 6, 4, 3, 2, 5, 7. We're having a test tomorrow. Okay, there's no way that you can remember all of those.
Right. They're abstract. It means nothing.
That's exactly right.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, this simplification becomes ridiculous to me. I wasn't aware of this. In some of these simplified versions of the Boxcar Children, the Cordyce and McAllister families were called the Aldens and the Moores. I mean, that's almost an insult to a 9-year-old. Is it really Cordyce and McAllister? That's too complicated?
Yes, because it wasn't on your list, your word list from your basal readers. Now, if you've not taught how to break things down, how would you decipher that? My 1st grade curricula was the Reading for Meaning Paul McKee series. And in there, it tells you flat out, I have the teacher's manuals, and I include that information in my book. It tells you they don't introduce vowels because they're so unreliable till sometime in 2nd grade after they've already mastered this word attack. Now, how do you do that without repetition and pictures and somebody leading you into the answer of what that word is. It can't be done.
Here's a sample from the 1924 version. Conquering, delegated, delicatessen, devouring, embarrassed, and enameled, engineering, harmonious, you mentioned harmonious, marshaled, presumably, piazzas, triumphantly, wriggled, vigorously. What was the target age for that book, Boxcar Children?
Well, I have the second one, the old one, and it says right in there flat out that a second grader should be able to read that book because it went along with the basal readers, the vocabulary that they would have had up till then.
Okay.
If I could add something to that, though,
yeah.
There's two different sites where they have reading levels, and one of those is Accelerated Reader. So if you would look up Surprise Island, the second Boxcar Children book, on the Accelerated Reader site, it would tell you it's for, I believe, a fourth grade, second month reading level. Mm-hmm. Well, my old book tells you it was for second graders, right?
Yeah, right.
And now they have it in comic book form. Unless the dumbed-down versions are too difficult for the children, we now have comic book form.
So the dumbed-down content has to be dumbed down?
Yes.
Just ad infinitum?
Yes.
When did the shift from this kind of elevated, rich, vivid, descriptive material for young children begin to shift into an agenda that introduced sexual experiences and completely removing the stigma of divorce, except as it affects the kids? The name that comes to my mind is Judy Blume. Are you there, God? Is it Dear God, It's Margaret? Yes. Are you there? Something like that?
Yes, yes.
Is that early 70s? Am I misremembering the era?
I can't place the year right now.
Yeah.
It would be the 70s when most of her books came out. Forever came out in 75. But, it's a good question. I can't answer that specifically. There's millions of books out there. I don't claim to sit here and tell you I've read them all. It's impossible. But I do remember very well being in fourth grade. I remember, the picture of the classroom and the whole bit. Mm-hmm. And there was a new book called Irving and Me by Sid Hoff, who did Danny and the Dinosaur.
Yes.
And in that book, it talked about the man at the Y, basically being infatuated with one of the women there and how she was built and making out. It introduced Playboy magazines that they were looking at. And it was totally different from anything that you and I would have read back then at 9 years old. It was published in 1967. And so even then, I knew that was different. So from that, we can say that things had started back then. So when I do the Kinsey chapter in this book, I start with the causal factor of his sexual from birth. I go by decade starting in the 60s.
So sexual from birth, for folks who are not familiar with that, one of Kinsey's false premises is that we're all polymorphous perverse, as Freud said, from infancy. And that gets into a whole other criminal, very disturbing element that we can probably touch upon, because since we're talking about Alfred Kinsey and his toxic influence. So this Kinseyan premise begins to be imported all across the map by the American Library Association, by professional educator groups. I did a video commentary a few months ago on this new trend of drag queens at libraries. Yes. And the American Library Association, at their recent Washington conference, they had subgroups like Klatch breakout caucuses on how to get around parental objecting.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And just push it in. They don't even hide it.
Well, they're not the first ones to do that. Ursula Nordstrom was an editor with Harper, Harper and Row, and then, now it's HarperCollins. But I think she started working for them probably in the 30s, and then she became the head children's editor. And she stated flat out, and I repeat that in my book at least 2 times, is that their purpose was how to get those books through the gatekeepers to the children. Now, who would be a gatekeeper? This would be your parents, and this would be your librarians. What would they have been putting in the books in the 60s that this would have been an issue? And so I deal with that. The first homosexual character in a child's book was published by Harper in 1969. And the book was by John Donovan. And it says, I'll get there, it better be worth the trip. And in a book called Dear Genius by, I think it's Leonard Marcus, I quote him in there, they have her letters and her correspondence trying to weave whatever she could do to get that book published and out there, because Ursula Nordstrom was a lesbian, and John Donovan, that wrote the book, was the head of the Children's Book Council, and he was a homosexual also.
So, as the phrase goes, they can't procreate, but they can recruit.
Yes.
What is metametrics? And I want to get into Lexile as well.
Okay. Parents and teachers go to either Accelerated Reader or Lexile to find out a reading level. Now, let's qualify that first, okay? First of all, I always say that reading levels are really erroneous, okay? Because it's like being pregnant. You're either pregnant or you're not pregnant, okay? You can either read or you can't read. Vocabulary is developed, okay? But your child, once they learn to read, they can read a word whether they understand what it means or not, right? So if you and I were trying to come up with a reading level, you and I would be really basing that upon vocabulary. You know, my child doesn't know, you know, what these words mean yet. But when they're doing reading level, they don't explain it completely, but it has to be based on words that your children have learned along the way. You know, if it was based on basal readers, that would make sense that you would have reading levels, right?
Yeah. Quick sidebar, who determines the basal levels, basal readers?
Well, I mean, those were, you know, you have the Dolch word list. You have, which started out, and he had, you know, his particular list, which was fairly small with 95 nouns in addition to that. Then you had the Fry list that went to 1,000. You have all kinds of schools that send home high-frequency word lists. See, these are the words that, when nobody has a real vocabulary, these are the words that are used in society today.
Yes. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
So they're going to these sites, and we can talk about both of them. But Metametrics has the Lexile. They have the Lexile framework for reading, okay? And so what happens with that is if on your child's, say, your yearly testing, and it says your child is on a 720 Lexile level, then translated, that means that they've leveled books also. So if your child chose a book that was on a 720 Lexile level, just like they are, they should be able to comprehend at least 75% of it.
I see.
Okay, now you have two problems. First one is, are those levels reliable? Okay, because you can have a book, say, The Sound and the Fury, and it might be considered on the same level as a little dorky preschool book.
Right.
Because there always has to be a criteria, and sometimes it's sentence length. So one of the things that I've discovered is, how do young children talk to you? Daddy, I went to Grandma's today, and I got to see a pony, and we had donuts, and then Grandma took me for ice cream, and then we did this and we did that. That's a long sentence. Yeah. Okay? And so when you take a book like that and you put The Sound and the Fury by Faulkner on the same reading level, really? That's why they teach Faulkner in advanced high school classes and college?
Yes. Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So with the Lexile, I had tended to, when I was reviewing things, I would go to Accelerated Reader. But one day I looked up a book I was reading about a lesbian relationship in a young adult book. And I saw that they had their power vocabulary words. So I thought, well, this is interesting. So I wrote the words down in the front of my book. And as I read the book, I circled the words. Well, later, when I checked their website, the word list had been changed. So I was rather curious. And one of the words in there was bud, B-U-D.
Mm-hmm.
Bud was one of the males in the book.
Yes.
Okay, we're not talking bud on a tree. And even if I were, and calendars was one of the words. So you're supposed to be old enough and mature enough to understand this lesbian relationship, but the definition of calendars has eluded you up to this point?
Yeah, right. You can see the...
So,
yeah.
Yeah, and so I'm just a grandma, and I was a mom that just asked questions. Well, why? Why would you have calendars or zip or yes? And then the more I looked, I saw they also had all of your profanities that you can imagine too. So they would have 10 power vocabulary words. Some of them would be names. They might have Patrick, they'd have Debbie and Sally, and then, an F word and, and something else. And it tells you that these words were important for the kids to know. Well, I just started digging and looking. So I have tables on there that I have listed with these words. Well, now they've got a whole new website without those words, but the old one is still online for people to check. You can check everything except for the tailored vocabulary with their mother effing word.
Yes.
Which I show 13 times. Those have already been removed, but the old site is still up where you can check it out. So all I'm saying is parents need to ask your questions. Why? Is this just some accident where an algorithm, the computer programmed itself?
Yeah, it's AI, right? Artificial intelligence.
Right.
Is that the FAB text lexile?
Yes. Yes,
so
sir.
For parents who think that that me and my guest are exaggerating, fab.lexile, lexile.com. It's .com, right?
Yeah.
And punch in, let's say, Bronxwood.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good one word.
Yeah, Bronxwood, and get back to me on what the highlighted words are. I think it'll be a very nasty wake-up call.
Okay. Well, first of all, there's two names. Cal for Calvin. Okay, and the third word in there is Jasmine, but the second word is the F word. So now it says Cal effed Jasmine.
Right.
Okay, so I'm sure that was just a coincidence, and those algorithms don't know how to remove profanity or proper names, right?
Right. Could you say they accidentally gave away the whole story? Right there.
Well, no, but Calvin didn't do her.
Okay.
Somebody else did in the story. Plus, she on her 16th birthday, the 40-some-year-old man took her to Connecticut now because now she's 16 and the age of consent is 16. So basically, he had raised her and provided for her those last few years, waiting till that age of consent.
Yes.
So I think maybe you might have other words for that also.
Gotcha. I hear that. On page 78, you talk about profanity and the attitudes toward profanity among publishers and people who decide the content for kids' books. And it's hard to tease out what's the cause and what's the effect. Certainly, by any metric, whether it's late-night comedian content or sitcoms or films, we've become a more profane, more potty word. I'm sad to say, I wish the president, Donald Trump, would stop using profanity in public. It just drives me around the bend. There's no need for it. So that is certainly advanced, but I don't think parents are aware of how advanced it has gotten. You've just done all the heavy lifting. One name that keeps popping out by way of author is Jason Myers. Jason Myers' books seem to top. They seem to be what's the best metaphor? The heavyweight champion of the world for all manner of C words, D words, MF words, P words, things that are anatomically impossible, And these books are available in libraries, and they are pitched to, is this preteen, upper grade, middle?
I could hold up in the screen for you where it says Simon Pulse, Simon & Schuster Children's Publishing Division.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
Yeah.
And I mean, that blows your socks off. But one of his books has 1,329 F words alone.
Yeah. It's the Marty Scorsese of the middle school reading set. Eric Devine, his book Tap Out, 896 Fs, 32 dams, 411 SHITs. Wow. Does everything have to be, every noun have to be preceded by a potty word? Apparently it does.
Yeah, well, he's a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? But let me explain these charts. Okay? This isn't charts just showing you profanity in children's books, because there are many, many books that are much worse for children. These are ones I found on the Accelerated Reader site. Mm-hmm. So I would go through the site, and if it said pervasive profanity, or if it said profanity or mild profanity, I would check it out. If I had access to the book where I could look it up, I did those 3 words for you in those books. The Jason Myers books with 1,329 F words is not included because that particular book wasn't on the AR site.
I see.
Okay, so these are not the end all. There are many that would be much worse. My point in showing this is if you look at the pervasive profanity list, the bottom of the chart goes to only 11. So we're going from 1,339 to 11. Now you look at the profanity chart and you see that range, and that range overlaps the pervasive profanity. And then I have pages that show books with horrible profanity that have no warning whatsoever. So my point, other than showing you how much profanity is in there, is showing you cannot trust these descriptions. Yep. See, people think that if a book says this one is sexual and the next book doesn't list the sexuality or the profanity, they think that it is fine. Mm-hmm. But it might be worse than the other one.
And an example you give on page 81 is how misleading it is to lump something like Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain in with one of these garbage books. You've got the character of Nigger Jim. You've got hell, mentioned. There's sort of I wouldn't call naughty, maybe naughty words, less than potty. Obviously, they don't qualify as obscenity, but someone could do an algorithm analysis of Huck Finn or the Adventures of Tom Sawyer and say, you know what? See, these even the classics have these problems. So just chill out.
Well, there's so much controversy over teaching Huckleberry Finn anymore. It's fine to teach about every different way of having sex by the time you're 10, but Huckleberry Finn, that's a real problem, right?
Even though its premise is anti-racism.
Yes.
Just like there's a move to remove To Kill a Mockingbird, same thing.
Yes, but they list that as they say in the description on Accelerated Reader, it says racial slurs, I think that's how it's worded, okay, and profanity. So those are 2 different things. So when they're using the N-word, we're not talking about profanity, right? So I have ran every curse word I could think of through Huckleberry Finn. Mm-hmm. And the only thing that I find in there is there are 2 hells, and they are as the place. Because he was afraid, they're not capitalized, but he was afraid of going to hell if he didn't turn Jim in. Yeah,
not a swear word, a location.
Yes, it was a location, and he was afraid of going there. So I thought that was very interesting.
Wow. My goodness. Maybe we can turn a little bit back to Alfred Kinsey and the infamous column in which young children, even infants, had, and this is why I was going to give an adult advisory for listeners, provoking orgasms in toddlers.
Yes.
Who orchestrated that, and of what value was it thought to be from a scientific point of view?
Well, they use, I'm sure Dr. Reisman, she's the expert in this. Everything I have learned from Judith and her works. But number one, I mean, these were pure pedophiles.
Mm-hmm.
I was reading through the chapter 5 of the Kinsey book one time, and I called
Human Sexuality and the Human Male.
Yes.
1948 was the first one, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
right. And the female was 53.
I see.
So I was reading through the 48 one, and I called Judith and I said, "Let me read this to you." And I kept reading through it. I said, "Does this say what I think it says?" And it flat out, when it's describing, remember, they're talking about children. And some of these are just a few months old. These are infants.
Mm-hmm.
And it's talking about their experiencing anal contractions. And I'm not trying to be crude or vile, but wouldn't somebody sit there and ask how you would know that?
Yeah.
That's not observable.
Yeah, unless the children are naked and being observed closely.
Or being penetrated.
Right.
Yes. Okay. And so you look at this and you see that Kinsey was paraded around as he was, and who funded him, and the outcome of all of the laws in this land that protected women and children all being changed, sitting there saying that all males basically, committed sodomy, and so everybody would be in jail, and all married women were having abortions.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we don't change these laws, then everybody's going to be in jail. So nobody asked the questions. And I said, you're culpable if you just blindly were one of those reporters pushing, Kinsey and saying how great he was. Or you were complicit, one of the two. You cannot possibly read that chapter and come away without knowing these children were violently abused and continually abused. It says right in there, they were observed for years.
And a guy by the name of Hugh Hefner decided to become Alfred Kinsey's pamphleteer, which he did with the Playboy Empire and that whole philosophy. Then actor Liam Neeson played Kinsey in the film, the eponymously titled film. Laura Linney was in that movie as well. You have to wonder, Debbie, do the creators of these dramatic versions, in the case of the film, would they have read that? Or would that have been not presented to them for obvious reasons?
Well, I can tell you this. I know that Judith tried to intervene and let people know. And it didn't stop anything. They still did it. So, who knows?
So, another accelerated reader, just in case you think we're getting a little too obscene, let's jump now to A Disco Bloodbath by James St. James.
Okay.
That's a 1999 book, which was made into a movie.
Yes, and that was not a book written for children.
Right.
James St. James, for those probably in your 50s or 60s, you might remember the club kids from the 80s because they were paraded around Geraldo and the Jerry Springer Show, Joan Rivers, Phil Donahue. Mm-hmm. Okay, and these were drag queens. And so Michael Alig and James St. James were a big part of those club kids. And Michael Alig is one who killed his pusher and then cut him up in his bathtub and threw the pieces into the Hudson. But you'll be happy to know he's already out of prison. And you can find on YouTube pictures of him with the amazing Desmond. The little kid that they paraded.
The autistic boy they're exploiting and destroying.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you've got videos, and I mean, it's creepy. It's very, very creepy to look at. But James St. James wrote a book about this time period with the club kids and the murder. And it was called Disco Bloodbath. Then it was made into the movie Party Monster with Macaulay Culkin. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Who played the innocent boy in Home Alone, for folks who don't remember. Yeah.
Right. And then Dutton approached him. You can still go on YouTube, and on Gay Action News, they have an interview with James St. James, and he tells you straight out in there that Dutton approached him to write a book for children. Dutton. So what was the book about? Yeah. Mm-hmm. It was about drag queens. Okay, so here's one of the things I want parents to be aware of. We don't live in the same generation that we grew up in. Kids have access to smartphones, they have access to computers, and even when you were a child and read a book, you probably thought that Franklin W. Dixon was an actual human being with that name, that maybe you could write him a letter and he would answer you the letter. And
100%.
Yes, and I would have written to Carolyn Keene, and we would have been absolutely thrilled. Well, kids are still enamored, but it's easy access to go on the internet. Well, the book jacket on Freak Show actually tells you that James St. James works for Worlds of Wonder. So I would go to looking all that up just as the kid would. And anyway, you can go to that site and see the things that he's written and be appalled when you see the whole site. But you can also go to YouTube and enter his name and Daily Freak Show, and there's 200 and some episodes. And almost all of them at the very end advertise that book for children, okay, about the drag queens. And you would be appalled to read the book. It is in an elementary school in my state. Now, I went to one of those episodes today, and the very end of it, they're talking, it's two transgenders, because this is what this is about. And they were sitting there saying that they're so tired of the Valley Girls using the OMG. And so they go around saying, Hail Satan, because, God doesn't want them to do anything or have fun. And Satan is so much more interesting. This is the kind of authors that they're soliciting.
What about elements of the occult? And this, is it R.L. Stine, the Goosebumps series?
Yeah, I haven't read those in years and years and years.
I'm sure that they've been supplanted by even more explicitly satanic in nature.
Surprisingly, I did this for a long, long time. So it's probably been about 30 years ago. But I found a book published by a major Christian publisher, and it was pure witchcraft, pure, not even a thing saying that anything was wrong with it, and the spells worked in the book, and that's how it was left. And then I found 2 other books by that same company published, and they were purely demonic. So it's across the board.
Is this something you get into in the Christianity 101 through the lens of Kitty Lit?
No, I don't cover the occult in there. What I do is I cover how they deal with God, Christ, Christians, and Christianity. And you would be
okay, that's right. Yeah.
Yes.
I was reading this last night out back, and I had to, every couple of minutes I had to put the book down because I thought, this is so extreme, and it's when you shed some light on it, it's so obvious the biases and the agenda that's being sold. And another note that I've noticed, even in Catholic schools, I'm embarrassed to say, is that treatment of Islam in its various forms versus, say, Christianity, the Jewishness of Christianity, very different set of lenses. Very pro-globalism, pro-environment. They couldn't get any traction with global warming, so they had to rebrand it as climate change. And I'll bet you if you polled 99% of students who are 14 years old, they don't know that it's not settled science. It's
right.
Just thrown as fact.
Yes. My husband likes to remind everybody quite frequently that when he was growing up, the Ice Age was going to destroy us before now.
Right. You can probably go back and find Time magazines about the coming Ice Age.
Yes.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, they sell us fear. If it's not the Ice Age, it's AIDS for everybody. If it's not AIDS for everybody, it's Ebola. If it's not Ebola, it's SARS. It's the fear du jour.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Who's behind all this? It's fun to play conspiracy theorist, but is there a clique, a group, a fund, a grant, a foundation that is first of all financially funding books like this, and the obviously manipulated algorithms so that parents are kept in the dark?
I try not to speculate in the book. People will find in my book that I pretty much just try to state it like it is, and then I give you 900 and some endnotes so that you can look it up and find out that it's tenfold worse than I've told you in the book.
Yes, that's literally probably true.
Yeah, it is. But, one of the things I asked myself these same questions over the years. And, let's just say you have a book company and 7 other people here have a book company. And let's just say you're evil, okay? And you just like everything bad. Okay, I would expect that the books I buy from you would be inappropriate, okay? But I wouldn't expect that across the board the other 6 would have to be like that. But somehow corporately, at the same time, what you would deem as competitors were all promoting the same types of material. I like to describe it this way. When I was a child and we had spelling words to learn, many times we had to write a story using those 25 spelling words. And sometimes that was hard. I've read children's books, especially juvenile ones, and they will name drop words in there, Patrick, that have no relevance to whatever in the world the storyline is even about. And so you sit there and you think, do they have to put those in there?
Yep.
And product placement is another one that upsets me a lot. And there's a lot of argument about that. They say that nobody's getting paid for that in children's books. Because remember, Christopher Whittle with Channel 1 got in huge trouble for advertising to a captive audience when they installed all those TVs in the classrooms in the 80s or 90s.
I don't remember that. What was that, briefly?
He donated televisions to various classrooms. And so every day when you would go in, you were watching Channel 1, which wasn't a conservative news source, but you would have the advertisements, perpetual from Nike and and all of these places. Well, the kids were a captive audience in the classroom. It's not like they could get up and leave. So they're forced, to be watching all of these ads, which I'm sure were very effective to come home and ask mommy and daddy for, right?
Yeah.
But in children's books, that is something that puzzles me a lot. Diet Coke is the most common drink in kids' books, I can tell you.
Interesting. You have to wonder if money's, being handed as a back channel spliff. Thank you.
The one I was reading at 3 o'clock this morning, though, really threw me because it was Pepsi.
remember Pepsi?
I'm not used to seeing that. It's usually it's not even Coke. Usually it's Diet Coke.
Yep. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he will not depart from it. Proverbs 22, verse 6. You have a wonderful chapter called Developing Youth Activists. I just saw a youth activist today who started live action when she was 15 years old. Her name is Lila Rose. Lila is an absolute superstar, and she was encouraging 1,400 high school students to start now. If they want to fight for a cause, don't wait till you're 48. You can begin as you are. She modeled it by starting at age 15. Sometimes you look at the world and the adults seem clueless and the children seem more wise. What do you recommend to parents in terms of teaching their kids critical reading skills and having an eye for, get that radar detection device more attuned?
Well, when they're in public school, they are weaned on youth activism, okay? It's a blank slate for a cause. I am not for exploiting children. Now, when Lila Rose was 15, she's older, okay, and this is a real cause. But when you're sitting there and you're teaching kids, about the environment and the climate change, you're trying to put the pressure on a 7-year-old that the wisest people in our land haven't figured out yet.
Which is what has been done with Greta Thunberg.
Yes.
That's very almost a black and white contrast with someone like Lila.
Yeah, and it's brutal what they're doing. I quote one book in there, and the little girl says, she's 5.5 years old, and they're quoting her, and she says, I saw these bullies and everything, and I thought, well, I can do that too. What was she doing? She wouldn't have known the issue. She wouldn't have known whether you were a bully just because you disagreed with her father or mother, right? And, so I call that exploitation. And I don't care whether you're teaching them the right thing or the wrong thing. That's exploitation at that age.
Well, things like bullying have certainly been redefined and weaponized for a certain agenda. Same with hate. I mean, hate used to be an emotion. Now it's like a legal entity that can get you a fine if the party's aggrieved. What were we going to say?
Absolutely. But why is it that you're going to give the kids the Wonder Book and take them to the movie so that they learn how not to be bullies? Okay? And you're going to read them books about kindness and all these things, and all of a sudden they're not going to be bullies and they're going to be kind. But you can read a book that has graphic, violent sex in it and the profanity, and that doesn't faze them at all. See? I mean, they try to tell you that has no effect at all. They're not going to do anything. You read a book with 1,329 F words, and I can tell you, I have to read this stuff. And after you've read word after word, the one I read last night, I mean, my goodness, the one I read last night had 186 F words, 104 the D words, and 384 S words.
That's a lot. That's a festival of potty words.
Yeah, and you have to know that those words would go through your head. And so these kids are punished. I've walked into high schools and they'll have a big sign, big posters about they don't permit profanity, but then they give the kids all these books to read.
Well, that is hilarious.
What's more hilarious is most of these books are available as audiobooks now.
That's right. It doubles the irony, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Yeah, you can hear it, but don't repeat it. I'm going to be doing an interview possibly next week with Gil Bailey, who's an expert in the thought of René Girard. I'm not sure if you've heard of René Girard or not, but he's deceased now. He wrote about mimetic desire, and it explains bullying, it explains mob violence, it explains trends and fads. And his thesis is that people, it's not that they want something, they want what others want. He calls it mimesis. We want to be aligned with the tribe. We're like lemmings. And so we want to be the cool kids, and cool kids have cool language. So
they think they do.
Right, of course.
Yes.
Yes. What's the shortest distance between my listeners and your book? Just go to your website?
What'sinkidsbooks.org, yes.
So no apostrophe?
That's the only place I have it up right now.
Okay, all together. So it's there's no apostrophe. What'sinkidsbooks.org?
Yes.
Do you ever travel and speak?
I used to quite a bit. I like doing that. I like having several hours at least or an all-day thing with parents, because I like to take their questions. I like to be able to explain to them so that they know what to do for their own children. I'm nobody's guru where I sit here and give you a list and say this is what you read and this is what you don't read. I like to teach the parents so that they know what to look for, what to expect, and how to better guide their kids.
Here's an endorsement from Carl Priest, retired principal teacher, 34 years. The thorough and far-reaching research she has done in preparing Between the Covers is superb. This book will be an outstanding resource for parents and teachers, to which I could add youth ministers and pastors, who want to protect their children from indoctrination. I'll just flash the title here for my members who can see this on YouTube. Between the Covers, What's Inside a Children's Book. I'd love to have you write to me and tell me how much you enjoyed having Debbie DeGroff at your event. So, Debbie, I hope that happens. Of course, I charge a huge commission, but we can talk about that with my army of attorneys. Thank 60%. You for writing. Okay, I like the way you think. Hey, wait a second. Are you 40 or am I 60? Tremendous book. I know I hope it gets what it deserves, which is millions of readers, and I'll throw as much traffic at it as I can. And thanks for doing all the heavy lifting and for spending time with us today. I really appreciate your time, Debbie.
Thank you so much for having me, Patrick. I do appreciate it.
I was writing like a furious chicken during the show today. So if you go to patrickcoffin.media, you can see links to the resources that our guest recommended on today's show. Thanks again, Debbie. Godspeed.
Thank you.
All right. This is the Patrick Coffin Show. Be a saint. What else is there? Hey, this is Patrick Coffin. If you like what you see and hear and you want to see and hear more, consider joining Coffin Nation as a full member. Just click right here and find out more about what that means. Nipsey, my fedora. That's Coffin Nation, the world's largest online community of culture builders. Click right here. See you on the inside.